What is going on, everybody? Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast, or welcome back if you are a return viewer or listener. I'm here with my boy Aris Pina, who's, of course, as many know, just kind of my brother in history, dumb dude who just loves boxing history like myself. Aris, what is up, dude? How are you?
Everything's going good, man. It's been a minute, but we're here back with a banger today.
Yeah, dude, it's actually been even longer than a minute as far as any of these shows where we kind of like focus in on. I guess it's technically a true crime show, but
Sure.
that's not really necessarily what we're going for per se, but we're just talking about a big bad heavyweight, as we've talked about before, a guy who's just lived a life, that's for sure. Floyd Jumbo Cummings, and we both talked about him and figured this is a guy that is a good fellow to talk about.
Absolutely. He's one of those guys that, just looking at him, he was one of the most imposing figures, maybe in history when it comes just to straight up built. Like, he was an absolute unit. Like, shredded to like one of those guys that looked like he was carved out of stone, just like completely scary individual. And then he also comes from that era of the late 70s and early 80s of the heavyweight division where there was a massive transition going on and a lot of cast of characters and guys from the 70s holdouts that were still trying to like remain or partly retired or still trying to come back. And then he was a part of that new wave of guys that were coming on the scene and trying to challenge that. It was a very interesting time of what was going on in boxing. And then with all that too, he ended up playing a pivotal role in the Hall of Famer's last fight of his career, one of the all-time greats, in fact. So there's just there's a lot of loops and boundaries with what goes on with Jumbo Cummings. And then, like you mentioned too, it's all of that took place with all the chaos that happened outside the ring because that's what was even more so than like his career. His career is more so just a footnote compared to what ended up happening with him outside of the ring. So it's a very complicated and very interesting story. Compelling,
Yeah,
complicated.
well, it is, I guess, somewhat complicated too, in the sense that I guess if anybody has ever listened to or watched any of the kind of true crime shows that we've done, or any of the shows where we've gone a little bit more in depth into the life of any fighters or anything like that, I think we both, I hope, do a good job, but we definitely attempt to humanize these people and make sure that people understand that we don't think we're talking about objects. We don't think that we're taking any of this lightly, laughing at it or any of stuff like that. We're trying to make sure people understand that we do understand there's complexities in a lot of these situations. And it's going to be easy for a lot of people to go, yeah, Floyd Cummings, that's the guy that, fought Joe Frazier, but otherwise he sucked and he was an ex-con. And it's easy to kind of pigeonhole or kind of wrap that up into a sentence or two for fighters like that. And so the point is, we're trying to expand on that a little bit.
Mhm. Totally, totally. And a guy like Floyd Jumbo Cummings, like you said, he's just one of those characters that unless you're a massive fan, I guess, from like, that time period of the 80s or the 70s, or just like a boxing history buff like ourselves, the only way you would know of him is from probably knowing that he was Joe Frazier's last opponent, if really anything of that, you know what I mean? And then because that's just like a trivia question, who was Joe Frazier's last opponent? What was the result of that, or something like that? But like I said, there's just a lot more involved in the fact that again, he's one of those guys that came up in the prison system, which we'll get into in a minute, learn his tools of his trade over there. His career, even though it was relatively brief, considering others from that era, is still packed in a lot of crazy footnotes and and anecdotes like that. And just the host of guys that he fought, from Frazier to other contenders of that era, former champions, and it's just a really interesting, it's an interesting story there. And then after his post-fight career too, and what happens with him, and all that. This is well again, these are the type of guys that we try to like subject, that we do subjects on sometimes because their stories don't get entirely told all the time. You know what I mean? Like they just known as footnotes, and then just what you learn about in the little blips that you find on Google. So we're just trying to like rationalize a little bit, not rationalize, just make it a little just tell their story properly.
Yeah, so that's exactly why I think that complex is maybe not the wrong word for what we're talking about here, but just I guess adding some layers.
Sure.
So, I mean, I guess if you're going to set the stage a little bit, if you're going to kind of make people understand what's going on in the life of Jumbo Cummings, but also kind of where he was coming from and also the era of boxing that he was stepping into, obviously we're talking about a time where, his career started in the late 70s as a pro. But what happened was, like many, especially many uh, kids who were the sons and daughters of, like, especially people in the South who were perhaps sharecroppers, or people in the South who, were from, let's just say, a totally different era. Floyd Cummings was born in 1949 in Mississippi.
Mhm.
And like many people from those areas, when the industry started booming especially in post World War II, many of the black people from the South went to urban areas like Detroit, Chicago, New York, etc. And the West Coast probably didn't experience that nearly to the same degree because of how many fucking suburbs there are and how spread out it is and all that type of shit. But that being said, Floyd Cummings' family seemed to be part of that because Floyd Cummings, while being born in Mississippi, ended up in Chicago at a pretty young age. And unfortunately, in Chicago around this time, in the like late 50s, early 60s, that's exactly what wound up happening. Just like I said earlier, to kind of add some layers to this so people understand, if you were a person of color coming to these inner cities, there probably weren't going to be nearly as many opportunities as you were expecting. And on top of that, many of the people who were people of color were basically, I don't want to say forced necessarily, but yeah, forced to live in certain parts of town and stuff like that, and not really among all the fucking rich whites and that type of shit. So that meant that there was a lot of inner city crime, urban crime, whatever the fuck you want to call it, is for all the, you know, uh, anthropologists and shit like that. But that's exactly the kind of environment that Floyd Cummings grew up in. So, just to kind of give you an idea, uh, there were a handful of gangs right around from where in Chicago where Floyd was from. And we'll get into why this is important in a moment. But there were a couple of gangs called, for instance, the Blackstone Rangers, the East Side Disciples, and the Inglewood Disciples, that were basically, I guess, all rivaling around this same area that he grew up in. And so he found himself embroiled in a whole bunch of trouble because of that. And anyway, it's not to excuse any of the trouble that he got into later on, which was considerable, but he definitely grew up in a not nice environment.
I mean, to say the least. And he got caught up in shit relatively young too. I think it was, how old was he? 16 when when the robbery took place where someone was ended up being murdered, right?
Yeah, and basically, yes, and it was, I would imagine, probably not the first violent incident or gang incident. He probably didn't just like join the gang and then fucking shit happened the next day. You know what I'm saying? Like, so this was probably going on for a while.
But it just escalated quickly to that point. And
Totally.
right away, so he's 16 years old. It was I want to say it was like a liquor store robbery or something like that. But they went to a convenience store somewhere and there was an altercation and I believe it was Cummings that was the one that pulled the trigger.
Where did I
So
had it pulled up just a second ago. Give me just
yeah.
a sec. But yeah, basically you have the gist of it. Damn it, anyway, we'll get back to that in just a sec. But also he wound up getting shot in separate incidents where Floyd Cummings 16 and John Collins 19. The ambushes and snipings occurred, although leaders of the Blackstone Rangers and East Side Disciples promised that their 2,000 followers would abide by a truce they pledged July 21st in the presence of Police Superintendent O.W. Wilson. Both gang leaders asserted the series of shootings that began July 22nd were plotted by the Inglewood Disciples, a third gang, because there was basically, just a series of violent
Sure.
incidents and shit like that. But what you're talking about, damn, I just had this. I'll go back to it in a second. But yeah, they had been caught by some witness had witnessed there were four teenagers that had gone into this liquor store and had held up the owner or the person who was running the liquor store, and somebody had a knife. The lady saw somebody pull out a knife, and then they pushed this guy up against the wall. She said she didn't hear any gunshots, but the guy wound up shot twice in the head and dying. So obviously there were gunshots. But she said she didn't hear any gunshots, and the person she wound up, pointing out was Floyd Cummings is the person who pulled the
Yeah.
trigger. So in any case, he was embroiled in a lot of shit.
And right away, so he's around 16 years old at this point. And if memory serves me correct, because I don't have it up right now, but just doing the research for this, he was scheduled, he was sentenced to like what 60 to 75 years in prison for that. Like basically he was going to be there essentially almost for the rest of his life already, like before anything even got off the ground. And excuse me, while in jail, the first thing he wanted to do was just like get immersed into, I don't know, into something, like whether it be boxing or whatever. And he he found a fellow inmate and another person that kind of became like well, it wasn't an inmate, excuse me. I think it was a guard, because that was one of the first times where they incorporated boxing into like the routine of at the penitentiary. You know what I mean? Like they eventually did at Rahway State Prison for James Scott, and so on and so forth. So he goes under the tutelage, and from there, that's when he starts bodybuilding. And that's what became his first passion, as opposed to like boxing, really. Because his bodybuilding routine while in prison, I mean, think about it. Like, there's not a lot you can really do in there. You know what I mean? I was even watching the other day. Remember that show that's been on the past few years, past number of years, actually, 60 Days In, where they
Yeah.
take people and they put them in prison and they're supposed to get intel or whatever the fuck they're supposed to do. And you watch that show because I mean, obviously, it gives you a key into the life of what goes on around there. There's not a lot to fucking do all day. You know what I mean? You can sit there and you can play games and you can do other stuff, and there's like politicking for like honey buns and other weird shit. But like, some people
Yeah, you better
get,
hope you like playing chess or some shit, bro.
yeah, exactly. You know what I mean? And some people just be in the yard and just work out. And Cummings ended up getting to a ridiculous routine where at some point, after just like loads of working out, he was able to bench 400 pounds 10 times. And then eventually he was able to bench 500 pounds. And then he had he was running 6 miles a day and he was doing thousands of push ups and thousands of sit ups and just sets, easy sets after doing these fucking lifts. This was like a routine he did for 6 years straight. And before you knew it, he was molded into like this absolute Adonis that would even make a guy like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was pumped out of his gills with steroids for that matter, envious. Like Cummings had one of those, just one of those ridiculous physiques. He had a 32-inch waist. He had a back that just spread out that looked like Mount Rushmore, and was chiseled in every aspect of it. And that's from like just the dedication of going every day in the gym and doing that. And so Cummings was at that point too, with like the working out and the bodybuilding, that he was considering training for the Olympics. Like he was trying to see if he can, run in the what would it be, powerlifting, I would assume, that he would go into, because they don't have a bodybuilder one,
Yeah, I
right?
guess so. Well,
But
and sorry because I found this. I was obviously ill prepared. I think I just closed the tab, but I
yeah,
just wanted to, confirm real quick that it says in the Chicago Tribune here in June 17th, 1967, four sentenced to 50 to 75 years for a murder. Four men received terms of 50 to 75 years in prison yesterday for the murder of a South Side grocer in the holdup last January 3rd. Judge Harry Stark ordered sentences for Ernest Sawyer, Floyd Cummings, John Robinson, and Thomas Lee Baggett. A jury found them guilty June 8th of the murder of Sam Garrick in his grocery. A witness testified she saw them push Garrick back into the corner as he was closing it and saw him collapse inside the store. He was shot twice in the head. So anyway, just to kind of confirm, what exactly happened there. And then, as you were saying, he basically got into absolutely ridiculous shape. He was 6'4", about 230 pounds of like fucking pure muscle. And on
Yeah.
top of that, when it came to his actual athletic ability, usually when you see fighters and they're real hulking, a whole lot of muscle, like they get tired within about 30 seconds, or they have bullshit technique. It just sucks because having big muscles just doesn't lend well to the mechanics of like throwing punches. But in his case, it actually worked all right.
Totally. So, like I was saying, he was at this point an absolute unit. All right. And in the late 70s, I mean, obviously in the 70s, bodybuilding was taking hold and like steroids were prominent and remnant everywhere around there and all that. But like in general sports, you didn't really see body beautiful guys like that yet. Like in boxing, for instance, you didn't, there was a few instances here and there where you saw guys like really shredded, but it wasn't really still you didn't see body beautiful guys, especially in the heavyweight division like that. Ali wasn't completely shredded. Frazier wasn't shredded. Foreman was hulking, but he wasn't a shredded dude.
Probably the
Ron
closest at
Lyle,
that
Ernie
point would be like
Shavers.
Ernie Shavers, but he wasn't even that like shredded. It was just that
No,
he
he
was
was
just
just
fucking big.
oh yeah, exactly. Like you'd have to look at guys like Harold Johnson, for instance, in the light heavyweight division. He was a guy that was pretty
Like
shredded,
Mike Weaver, but he was like maybe a year or two later. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Exactly. That's what I mean. But even in wrestling for that matter too, you didn't find guys that were just like
yeah,
completely
not yet, dude.
like not yet. You
That
had
was like mid '80s type shit.
yeah, you had guys like that point like superstar Billy Graham who clearly was on the, roided out of his mind, but still he had an absolutely incredible body. Tony Atlas was another one for that matter who definitely had the same I don't think he was really into steroids that much either, but I mean, that dude was just like completely shredded. But most of the guys were built like Bruno Sammartino. You know what I mean? Big barrel chest, just stocky and clearly in shape, but like not like shredded. So Cummings was a different type of animal. And like I said, he was actually looking at first to join the Olympics, and I believe it would be for powerlifting. But then when he realized and saw what guys like the Russians were doing and others like that, and he realized, and I think he quickly realized from there that what he's doing is not quite at their level yet. And like what, for even for his size, it just wasn't going to equate to
Yeah,
success.
when motherfuckers are like 6'8" and like 320 pounds, it's not, it's shit is like those dudes are like barely human. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
and we've had like American powerlifters like Ken Patera, for instance, who was another professional wrestler. I'm name dropping, who competed against those guys and struggled. So I mean, like it's unreal what some of those guys were putting up in back then. You know what I mean? But that's no shame to Cummings. I mean, he was literally one of the strongest men in America at that point. A guy was just ridiculous. So after his powerlifting Olympic dreams dissipated a little bit, that's when he turned his focus more into boxing.
So he was at the Statesville Correctional Center, the Statesville Penitentiary in Illinois. And I mean, I don't know the inner workings of any of that type of stuff, and I don't know what it was like. All I know is that he was a massive guy, and
Mhm.
so I mean, even before going in, he was as a teenager supposedly a pretty big dude, but just got absolutely jacked in prison, and so obviously getting jacked is not going to save you from getting fucking stabbed or attacked with some weapon or something like that, but whatever it was, he survived about 11 years in prison, and in the last few years he was similar to James Scott, except for I know with James Scott it was like they had initially and there was others too, because we've talked about him in the other like true crime podcast. There's one or two others. Like there was the dude from in Connecticut. They had also instituted a similar program where they had allowed kind of like a conditional parole or conditional release for these guys, and they could go fight in tournaments while they were still incarcerated. And that's what Floyd Cummings was allowed to do. Apparently, he showed enough fighting prowess while in the prison that he fought his way out or whatever and was able to fight in a few tournaments, get some experience. And so by the time he was actually released, which I think was a bit of a surprise because I mean I think as part of this program also I guess it probably showed some measure of good behavior or whatever. And so in any case he was paroled and that's when he started his pro career.
Sure. And there was also he had a very good he didn't have a bad amateur career considering too. It was relatively short, but he had a lot of success early on. And to the point where he was being considered for a chance to join the 76 Olympic team or at least go to the trials for it because he was AAU champion. He did rack up a number of rings and there was, he had fights with like USA, like USA meets versus other countries. You know what I mean? USA versus Russia, USA versus this, whatever it may be. So like he was already accomplished, just is still while in the prison system. And the story was too is that he would be accompanied while he was going to these fights, what, in handcuffs and in shackles and all that, and then he would be allowed to go into the fight like that, like kind of almost, to make another wrestling reference when you see other guys come in there like that already, and then the manager takes them out and unleashes them onto the some poor schlub. But what a scene that must have been. So, anyways, he was considered to join the trials, and there was a lot of talk about that. But then the committee and everyone else agreed at that point that it wouldn't look good for a person who's still in jail as an inmate to try to be representing the country and yabba yabba yabba. So that kind of like cut it off. And so, like you said, soon after that, he still stood as an amateur after the 76 Olympics, but he turned pro in what, 1979, I believe.
Yeah, he was still fighting as an amateur in 1978.
Yeah,
Well, because he was still in prison, and so
sure.
he couldn't turn pro. I mean, he barely, I guess, had just missed. And on top of that, that was at Broadway. That was not in Chicago. So I mean, I guess it was probably I would imagine it was from state to state. They had different prison programs, different money allocation, all that type of stuff. And on top of that, I don't really know. It was Rahway State Penitentiary. Yeah, so Rahway's a state penitentiary. I don't really know what the fucking prison that Floyd Cummings was or how it was funded or who I have no fucking clue. So in any case, point is different states, they weren't allowed to do the exact same things, whereas James Scott and on top of that, we talked about this briefly before we start recording, but James Scott was allowed to fight a number of times while at Rahway, not only while serving time, but they brought the fucking fights to Rahway, which is a kind of dope. But they nipped the fucking that shit in the bud because I mean I think it was probably a number of reasons, some of them political, some of them there were probably just constituents fucking complaining, etc. So in any case they stopped that shit and Floyd Cummings basically just missed any sort of chance at doing that while incarcerated. So he kept fighting as an amateur. And then basically he was released. And as soon as he was released, he was like, well, what the fuck else am I going to do? And look at the guy. The guy is frightening looking.
Yes.
Objectively, he's a frightening looking fucking guy. Just a huge, like, he's got a menacing scowl. He's got the motherfucking facial hair. Dude is, there's no way. There are a lot of guys we've talked about like Bob Fitzsimmons is probably like the fucking quintessential who the fuck is this guy? If you're like in a bar and like he like knocks into you and he's just like, who are you?
Yeah,
You're like, who the fuck are you, bro? Floyd Cummings knocks into you and he goes, who are you? You're like, I'm nobody. Bye. Can I buy you a drink? What can I do
1,000%.
for you? You know what I'm saying? I'm just saying. So yeah, I'm just saying also freshly released from prison. I can't even imagine like freshly released from serving fucking 11 years for a murder or armed robbery or anything like violent. The idea of finding a job, dude, I can't even imagine what that's got to be like, bro. So if you have any sort of fighting prowess or can do anything where like, you don't have to go through certification or background checks and shit, that's what you should do. And that's exactly what he did.
1,000%. And the heavyweight division by the late 70s, we've talked about this plenty of times on different, shows. It was going through a major transition. Um, Muhammad Ali at
It
this
was wide
point,
open.
it really was. It was a weird time. Like Muhammad Ali was essentially retired, even though he was still in the spotlight and making rumblings about making a comeback. Joe Frazier, same thing. And then you had other heavyweights from the 70s who were still active, but like kind of almost being sort of they were transitioning. I don't want to say immediately, but they were transitioning into the role of gatekeepers for that new generation. You know what I mean? Guys like Ron Lyle, Ernie Shavers, Jimmy Young, and a couple of others that were still hanging on over there. And then you had the new breed that was like really coming up. Larry Holmes, who was around longer than others from the new breed era, if that makes sense. Like he had been a pro since like I don't know. Fuck, I think he turned pro after the 72 games because he lost to Bobbitt, right? He lost to Bobbitt in the trials, in the finals of the trials, and then I think he turned pro soon after that. So he had already been a pro for a long time, but I mean, before he became prominent and really people knew his name, like he had been on the fucking circuit for a minute before Don King finally took him in. So like Larry Holmes was a part of that new breed, I guess, even though he had been around for a minute. Then you had Greg Page, you had Tony Tubbs, you had uh Ronaldo Snipe. There was just, there was a lot of different Jerry Cooney, obviously. Like there was a lot of guys coming up on there from the new era that was supposed to like kind of push out the other.
Weaver, yeah, I mean,
Weaver, John Tate,
yeah.
you know, and obviously the South African franchise as well, which will somehow segues into this too. That everything figures into this little story. So, anyways, it was a different time. And then, Cummings would, like you said, with his size and everything like that, he fit perfectly into that. You know what I mean? He was a different look for, like we said, from everyone from that era. No one was quite, shredded like him, like we said Weaver was, but Weaver didn't even have a body like Cummings. Like Cummings was bigger than him. He was just it, like when we talk about the Frank Bruno fight, not to jump too far ahead later on, same thing. Like Bruno was one of those guys that had one of the most body beautiful, physiques you could ever see. And Cummings even looked more impressive than him because there's a photo of them together posing together before the fight. And it's just like, fuck, man. Like, Cummings looked like an absolute Adonis. Like, no one had ever really quite seen a guy that shredded like that and just massive and just everything. But it didn't really quite translate into the ring, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like he wasn't a massive puncher. He could hit hard, but he wasn't a guy that had like one punch knockout power. And he wasn't the most fluid guy either because his size did hinder him a little bit because he was so massive, but he wasn't just like a statue. Like, he could move and everything, but he was kind of like a plotter, you know what I mean? But that being said, he got through like his first round of opponents up until from 1979 up until 1981. And then in 1981, on a nationally televised fight, he ends up fighting one of these rising prospects that I talked about that were coming up from the new era, Ronaldo Snipes. And this happens in Atlantic City at the Resorts International, an unfortunate hotel that I've worked at many a times because it was the first hotel that ever opened up in Atlantic City, and it's at the very end of the boardwalk. And I've said this before to you on and off the show, but like for whatever reason, they never updated it after like 1981. And when you go there, it's literally just like an awful, awful, just it's just like a timepiece that's not in a good way, Back in 1981, at this point now, he fights Ronaldo Snipes, who is also undefeated. And Snipes, like I mentioned, was one of those guys that came as like the new breed of the heavyweights that are coming up now, as opposed to like the old guard that just kind of like crossed and passed. But this was a definite crossroads fight and like a big fight between like two up and coming fringe contenders almost on the rise to make it to the big time. And it was televised on national TV, all that. Like it was a good fight.
Yeah,
And
definitely a
so
clash in styles too.
yeah, not really essentially a good one either because Snipes, even though he was clearly more mobile than a guy like Cummings, like he still was kind of a plotter himself and not a guy that was like really had like a beautiful
Yeah.
style to watch.
He
You know
he
what I mean?
thought he was
Sometimes
slicker than he actually was. You know
a
what I'm
thousand
saying?
percent. Yeah. It was like he can be sloppy a lot and make for kind of ugly
Yeah.
fights when they're
More of a
like
classic fighter, but not nearly as slick as he thought he was.
exactly. And it took place at the Resorts Casino in Atlantic City, which unfortunately is still standing to this day. And like, quickly, the Resorts, that was Atlantic City's first casino to open up, I believe, on the boardwalk there. And it's at the very, very fucking ass end of the boardwalk, like all the way at the very end, which is annoying in itself to get there. But then two, the reason why I complain about it all the time is that like sure it's like a legendary venue when it comes to like fights from, the early 80s and stuff like that when Atlantic City was a hotbed for boxing. Problem was it hasn't been updated since the title reign of Matthew Saad Muhammad. Like it really hasn't. Like if you walk in there today, it's a time capsule, but not in a good way. Like you don't want to stay there. Maybe you want to like just view it, if you walk through it really quick or whatever, but you don't actually want to be in there and stay in that place
Yeah,
because
looks
it's
like
like that.
tacky.
I mean, just in every which way, bro. It's almost impossible to want to like stay. Like nothing has been updated since 1981. It's
It's
fucking
got the
horrible.
motherfucking like seashell fucking
Yeah,
motif with coral and
like this
fucking.
weird bathroom that you still have to like pull the lever down instead of actually having to like it's such a weird fucking place, man. I can't. I really hate it.
Good
Anyways,
for storing a gun for an assassination in an Italian restaurant, but
sure. Oh
that's
yeah,
it. That's
yeah.
the only thing
But
it's good for.
I just, and for whatever reason, Main Events decided to use that as their host venue for their NBC shows back in the 2010s. And so, anyways, back to the Ronaldo Snipes fight. It was like,
Staying true to Joyzy.
of course. Look, bro, this wasn't ice rolled anymore. All right, this wasn't the glory days. But the Snipes fight was the one that really showed Cummings's limitations, so to speak, because like we said, Snipes was not an extremely fast guy, but he was clearly more mobile than a guy like Cummings, who was outboxing him relatively easily. And once he realized he was able to hit him quickly, he was doing his way with him to the point where Cummings was getting frustrated, more and more frustrated into the fight. And then later in the fight, at one point, his frustration grew to like absolute insanity because he pulled a move that would become much more famous first by Andrew Galata and then later on by obviously most famous by Mike Tyson, is he bit. He took a bite out of Snipes. And
Yeah.
it was like around, I don't know, I want to say like eighth or ninth round or something like that. They were in a clinch and Cummings bites the shit out of Snipes right on his shoulder. And he bit him so hard that like there's a clearly like, a visible bite mark right there. Snipes jumps back like he's in visible pain. And I don't even think the referee took a point away from Cummings. Like he was just kind of startled
Yeah, I
by
think it
what
was Larry
happened.
Hazard too. Yeah, it was Larry Hazard.
Yeah. And Freddie Pacheco was the announcer, so it must have been on NBC. And Pacheco, being a former fight doctor, was like kind of freaking out. He was like, "Oh, I've seen guys bit before, but not like that." And he was like, "He's lucky. Man, if that broke skin, he'd need a tetanus shot. He needs a tetanus shot. And if he gets that, those really hurt." Like, and you think it's gonna hurt as much as him just getting bit the shit out of like he did? Like that was crazy. But that was that. I think that fight was kind of showing where Cummings was gonna like, his level at where the heavyweight division where he was gonna land. Because if you have a guy like Ronaldo Snipes, and no disrespect to him, he did end up becoming a very good long-standing contender up until the late 80s. He was more of a gatekeeper in the early 90s, but like he did, he had that memorable fight with Larry Holmes where he did drop Holmes and Holmes got up and fell face first into the turnbuckle post and a more jumpy referee in this era could have easily stopped it at that point. But like, and he made for more fun fights too, even though he was like ups and down, topsy turvy. But like I said, that being said, when you're being completely outboxed and outfuddled, befuddled by a guy like Snipes, that shows you your limits. But he has another win in 1980. So this is all happening in 1981 now. So he loses that fight. That was his first nationally televised fight. Wins a fight against a guy named Bobby Jordan, and then comes the infamous fight with a comeback in Joe Frazier.
If you actually go back a few fights, it's funny because he got a split decision in his first 10 round fight. He barely won, even though he had almost 30 pounds on this dude named Johnny War, who was 5-15. Which, I mean, look, dude, everybody's got an off night, everybody has bad nights. That's not necessarily like a fucking, Grim Reaper hanging over him or anything, but not a great sign. And then against Ronaldo Snipes, that was actually a pretty close fight too. It wasn't even like it was Ronaldo Snipes clearly outboxed him. I think that in the rounds that Snipes did well, he probably took more clearly, but
Mm.
it was still like it was sloppy. Like you said, it kind of showcased a bit of Cummings. I don't want to
Imitation.
say
Yeah.
I was going to say shortcomings, but now that's just an awkward sentence. God damn it! But his limitations. He
Yeah.
basically wasn't going to be a very fluid fighter. He pushed a lot of his punches because of his physique. He was a better puncher than you'd expect him to be, but he was still kind of like a kind of a guy that was, hulking and just not super, he wasn't great throwing in combination and that kind of shit. And so that being said, um, you kind of got the feeling looking back on it that a number of those opponents were probably just like looking at him and going, holy fuck, in a lot of those cases where they were, had losing records or were making their debut earlier on in his career when he was getting those knockout wins, maybe. But even so, like Joe Frazier, he's in bad shape. He's not fat, but definitely not in good shape. Definitely fatter than before. But also, Joe Frazier had been talking for years about how, he loved boxing, but he loved music more. He loved boxing, but he wanted to be a fucking entertainer. He wanted to be a showman. He wanted to be, do other shit. And he had started touring with his band, and
Mhm.
I know he had some success doing that. Exactly how much I don't know, but he did have some success doing that. He was not as good a singer as he thought he was, but he could carry a tune enough. Um, and so, I mean, it was fine. Like, it's cool. And I think a lot of people would probably show up just to see Joe Frazier, like see Joe Frazier and his band do some shit, whether
Of
it was good
course.
or not. So I think he had some moderate success doing some other shit. But obviously, during this time, or I should say right before this time, Muhammad Ali was obviously wrapping up his career. But apart from wrapping up his career in the late 70s and early 80s, Muhammad Ali's name was on fucking everything. His name was on every product, he had his cartoon in the late 70s, everything. And so, I think that Joe Frazier probably saw that and was just like, what the fuck? Like, I guess my best bet is to get back in the ring and see what I can do. And he probably saw this, you know, like you said, Larry Holmes, now looking back on it, had a far more firmer hold, and he was able to knock out and clear out a lot of the division. But at that time, a lot of people didn't really understand yet. And so Joe Frazier probably saw this and was just like, well, maybe I can come back. Maybe I could do some shit. And he was wrong.
Well, it's a very like we've talked about it in other shows, but it was such a muddled, interesting, like weird time in the late 70s. So essentially, Bob Arum makes Muhammad Ali retire. Like he pays him off. After Muhammad Ali regains the heavyweight championship from Leon Spinks for the third time in late 78, there was like a lot of speculation. What's he gonna do? Is he gonna retire? Is he not? Blah, 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 all this other shit. Arum offered him a substantial amount of money to basically, announce his retirement and give up the WBA title because Arum had plans of what he was going to do with it,
Yeah, basically the exact same thing that happened with Joe Lewis and the
Yeah.
tournament that they concocted in the late
Uh-huh.
40s.
Yep, yep, yep. Exactly. And Arum had plans for the WBA title specifically with South Africa. And, his dealings, what he was doing on over there. Another show that we've covered years ago. And we probably should do an update on that one too, since it's been so long and just it's still. But anyways, back to this. So the WBC was in Larry Holmes's hands. All right, Holmes becomes champion after beating Norton. After Leon Spinks got stripped, and they subsequently gave the Norton. And then Holmes becomes champion. So Holmes is under Don King umbrella, defending against non-essential guys like Ozzy Ocasio and and yeah,
Evangelista,
Evangelista and Mike Weaver, which ended up being almost a disaster, but still, you know what I mean? Like nondescript opponents, Leroy Jones and others, while just bitching and complaining that Muhammad Ali's in the shadow and pissing them off, and pissing off the general public. So back to the WBA, after Muhammad Ali announces his retirement and subsequently gives up the belt, initially the first fight that he was going to do to to just the claim the vacant title. It wasn't even going to be a tournament. He was just going to have Ernie Shavers fight Kali Kanutsa. That ends up falling apart for various reasons. And then after that fight didn't end up happening, that would have been a hell of a fight, by the way, too. But after that fight ended up falling apart, that's when Arum decides to make a four-person tournament where he was going to have John Tate, Kali Kanutsa, Harry Coetzee, and Leon Spinks. And from there, Spinks initially was going to fight Knudsen. Spinks's management thought that Coetzee would have been the easier option, so they went the Coetzee route, which ended up being a complete fucking disaster in itself. And then John Tate ends up stopping Kali Kanutsa, and then subsequently decisions Harry Coetzee. And so from there, John Tate, now the WBA heavyweight champion, former 76 Olympian, more personable than Holmes, even though he might not be as articulate. Unfortunately, we talked about that on other shows, or whatever. But like a night, a guy that has like a nicer personality, had an amazing smile, and just all that, right? And so for whatever reason, everybody was trying to, and maybe because they felt he was the easier fighter too. I mean, when it comes down to it, like, I mean, Holmes, as much as shit as he talked and as brooding as he was I think, the threat clearly was shown there that he was just like a great fighter. And why go through that when you have a guy like Tate, who, even though he had blown through Dwayne Bobbick and others, like, still might have a little bit of a question mark there. So guys like Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Ron Lyle, all of them were in contention. Ali, obviously, the most probable one to eventually fight Tate. And so Joe Frazier was clearly in this mix too. Joe Frazier, before he even got in the fight, Jumbo Cummings, was initially supposed to fight Kali Kanutsa back in like 1978, 1979. Frazier ended up pulling out, I believe, because he said he got hepatitis, I think it was. I was going to say malaria, but that wasn't it. He ended up catching hepatitis. And so he ends up pulling out after that. And then there were rumblings too of other fights he was supposed to have. At one point, he was supposed to fight Scott Ledoux, which, that would have been a fun little brawl forever, as long as it lasted. Ledoux was another one too that was always in the mix of who he was supposed to fight somebody at some point, and like different rumors or whatever. So at one point he was supposed to fight Scott Ledoux. That ends up falling apart. And then at one point he was just going to challenge John Tate and come out of retirement, which sounds ridiculous in itself, but that was like, rumblings for that too. And then it all finally comes to when now it's 1981. It's been a few years since all those other fights come to pass. And now he's on the trajectory with Muhammad Ali. Because Ali ended up coming back in 1980 to fight Larry Holmes, disastrously as it was, but he still wasn't done yet. And now it's 1981. Ali's going to fight Trevor Berbick. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, these fights were only scheduled like a week apart from each other, weren't they? They
Oh
both took
man,
place in December, so I almost think so.
I'd have to double check, but I know they weren't super far apart. But well, let's look. Let's not make fools of ourselves here.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So they were like maybe about a week or ish apart.
Yeah. And Frazier's came first. And honestly, if Frazier had won his fight and Ali had beat Berbick, there's no way Don King or anyone else would have not tried to make Frazier Ali 4 at that point. Like, that was definitely going to be in the works.
Of course.
As
Yeah.
ridiculous as that is, they definitely would have tried to done that.
That yeah would
Um,
have always been marketable no matter what. So of
yeah.
course they would have tried to put it together if they could have. But and I mean, look, dude, it's like the judges did everything they could here. They did.
They really could. And, Cummings before the fight was asked about it, and he was like, I'm not afraid of Joe Frazier. I'm afraid of killing him. Well, and doing his most intimidating sounding, and a guy that hulking, well, sure. And it's interesting that it ends up at the amphitheater in Chicago. And also, too, it wasn't televised nationally anywhere either. Like, Frazier's star had diminished so much, and this fight brought so little meaning to anyone that they struggled to find like any type of outlet to televise this. And, unlike the bright lights of Vegas or anything else where, a guy like Madison Square Garden or something where Frazier used to pack it in, same thing. They're not gonna, this showed that the star power was gone from these guys. Because, I mean, considering too, Muhammad Ali ends up fighting in the fucking Bahamas for his last fight a week later. And it's like, so that being said, Cummings, for all of his talk beforehand that he said he was going to kill Frazier and all that, I mean, it's not really a good fight. You know what I mean? It's not a bad fight, but it's not like one of those fights that like Frazier is clearly washed. Like, he has the punch over his stomach. The hook he can still throw, but like it's slowed and dull and just not there, and everything is just in slow motion with him. And Cummings, even though he probably should have won the fight, like he wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary too, aside from a round or two where he actually hurt Frazier and looked like he had Frazier on, ready to be finished. He didn't really he just more nullified Frazier than really did more of his offense of himself, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't like a really pleasing fight. It was just one of those meandering 10-round fights that like you have an aging legend who can't do it anymore against a guy who either he can't himself or just like really unwilling, maybe a combination of both, put the finishing touches on a guy like Frazier. It just becomes like a slog. But that being said, like you just alluded to, the judges did go, everything in their power to make sure Frazier wouldn't go out with a loss. And like a draw was like their way of doing that.
Yeah, like it was like they couldn't give it to Frazier because it wasn't, was not a Frazier win, but
Mhm.
at the same time, they didn't want to give him an L either, so they did like what they could. So
Sure.
I almost respect it, but the dude hadn't fought in almost 6 years, and also I think that another facet of this that I don't think I heard you say was that I think a big portion of it was that Joe had been running his own gym, and
That's right.
also he started, handling the career of his son Marvis, and also a number of Marvis's like friends and other young kids who were like, close to him and stuff like that, who were out of his gym around this time, and I think that that probably inspired him. Like, oh, like look what they're doing. I think I could do that too, type
He
of shit.
alluded he alluded to that in his autobiography as well.
And so
Like
I
he
think
started running with Marvis, he was running with his kids and all that, and he was like, "Well, I can give this another go and want to go do it." And
right,
it is sad though to watch how because those I mean we look at those '70s heavyweights as larger than life, right? And it's just like sad to see because I mean it's inevitable with anyone in boxing. You know what I mean? Like that's just how the way guys go out. Even the great, if like Sugar Ray Robinson, the greatest of all time, if that's how he goes out, 99% of the rest are going to go out that way. But it was just sad to see guys like Ali, Frazier, Ken Norton, who I did not mention, get because he got obliterated by fucking Jerry Cooney, um, Ron Lyle, Jimmy Young, and I think that's might have more so it because like I can't really think of any other higher name guys from the '70s hanging on the '80s like that. But just the way to see all of them go out the way they did, you know what I mean? But
totally.
yeah,
Well, and it was kind of a double-edged sword too, because on one hand, he didn't have the kind of style that required fast reflexes like Ali, for instance.
sure,
But at the same time, he also took a lot more punishment. He took like, that was part of his style and also part of his mentality, not just his
yeah,
style. Like he was just like a let's get this shit done. Like and if I gotta fucking eat some shots to get it done, then oh well. And that really obviously came back to haunt him in numerous ways. And, in this fight in particular, too. I mean, it obviously was not helpful. But, it also, in that sense, like against Jumbo Cummings, like you were also saying, he was either unwilling or, a mixture of unwilling and unable to really
mhm.
pull the trigger or have that style to counteract what Frazier's style was.
It's definitely for the best that Frazier just scored a draw, if not a loss, whatever it may be. Because if they had given him a win or whatever it may, like it, he would have continued. He absolutely would have continued and at least had another fight or two. Just like Ali was even thinking about doing the same too. There's a book out there on Ali's last fight, a very good book. I don't have it in front of me called, talking about Muhammad Ali's very last fight with Trevor Berbick. And even after that fight, there are people in his ear telling him, Ali, you won that fight. You really won that fight, blah, blah, blah. And then, like, the next day or two, reporters were coming to him. And initially, after Ali said, this is it, I retired, whatever, he started saying, well, I'm not sure yet. And people were like, why? And he was like, well, because now people are telling me that they think I won that fight and that they didn't give it to me because they thought I would continue. And that's the only reason why they didn't give me the fight. And now I'm believing that I can still win. And, there was up until like 1983, there was rumors that Ali was still going to fight until finally it was like, all right, no. But yeah, it was that, Frazier's retiring like that, Ali retiring in '81. Ron Lyle essentially retiring in 1980 before his ill-advised comeback in the mid '90s, and then Ken Norton retiring in 1981. Um, Basically laid the heavyweight division from like that left the rest of the '70s heavyweight division gone. The only one left was still Ernie Shavers, who still somehow fought until like 1987, '88, but whatever. And so his next fight, though, and this is a fascinating one too, was against another guy that we've actually featured on the show years ago, another ex-convict, another guy who had a crazy, crazy past and a subsequent crazy career, Jeff Sims.
Yep, which would have been a just a fun, rock'em sock'em type of fucking fight where you just stick two guys in there with each other, just see what fucking happens, bro. You know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? Sims was a troublemaker guy himself, big, hulking, scary looking. He had been kind of in and out of issues for a long time. Trained out of the Fifth Street Gym in Miami for a bit, and also had been notorious for sparring sessions and bringing it in the gym. And a particular sparring session where he split Ali's lip, and
Yep.
which led to his Dark Gable phase. Love it. But nonetheless, that's exactly who Floyd Cummings was put in with in his next fight immediately after Joe Frazier. But I mean, look, dude, from an objective standpoint too, you'd probably have to look at it and be like, if you're handling Floyd Cummings, you're kind of thinking, damn, dude, Frazier looked like shit. My guy couldn't put him away. My guy couldn't do shit with him. That's not a good sign.
Totally. You would think that. I mean, like Frazier looked bad, bad. Like
Yeah, I
anyone,
mean,
any sort
objectively,
of
not a great sign.
yeah, any sort of purpose that night would have put Frazier away. Like, I mean, if that fight with John Tate or Mike Weaver or whoever for the WBA title had come to fruition, Frazier would have got hurt badly. Like, I don't, no question. You know what I mean? And so a guy like Cummins, like we said, he had Frazier teetering a few times on the verge of being stopped, but for whatever reason, just couldn't put the extra go to finish him off. And leave enough and leave it close enough that they can salvage a draw without enough people like making grumblings about it. You know what I mean? So yeah, but and then going against a guy like Sims, and so like we mentioned, like I mentioned earlier, Cummings, as massive as he was, wasn't a one-punch knockout artist. Like he could hit and he could certainly hurt you, but he wasn't just like a guy that could like cold cock you and send you into another, deep realm with just one punch. A guy like Jeff Sims could. Even though Sims wasn't built the way Cummings was, he was a built guy himself. We've talked about it, on the show.
Yeah,
He
he
came
looked a
from
little bit more like a fighter, like
yeah,
than Cummings.
totally, and he just came from I don't even possibly even more rough beginnings than Cummings did too. Like he was just a really bad individual. So both of them crossing paths like that is kind of a fascinating event. And then if that happened today, um, if this fight happened today, the promoters of it, because it would obviously be on television, the promoters of it would definitely play up both of them having their backgrounds and talking about this is a cross meeting of two former inmates and yabba 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 and what's going to happen and all this shit. Oh, they're going to meet on the yard this time, except it's in the ring. And it's like, I don't know, come up with a bunch of dumb shit that they would
The
just,
whitest 1980s voice. Two men from the
yeah,
ghetto.
totally something Bob Aaron would be into. You know what I mean? I can't
Oh
even,
yeah,
but
there'd be graffiti all over the promo
it
material,
was just
guaranteed.
ridiculous. But the fight ends up happening. What was the main event of that? Because it happened on a prominent card. I just got to see over here. It was
Let's look.
oh
Jimmy,
Jimmy Young, Greg Pace. It's not prominent, but I mean it was. But
yes,
regardless,
yeah, totally a Don King card. Makes sense.
yeah. But
Yeah, Mitch
regardless,
Mitch Blood. We got. I'm sorry to interrupt. You got David Bay, Mitch Blood Green. You got fucking John Mugabe at 10-0 on that shit. So yeah, it's a
it's definitely a Don King card.
yeah. It's got the Don King special on there.
And Sims ended up not like I said. Sims was a monster puncher. Jumbo really wasn't. Sims was a natural boxer, like you said, a more natural fighter than Cummings was too. And since he wasn't as big, he moved a little bit better. I mean, Sims was no like graceful fighter himself, but he knew how to box. All right, like, and he came up through the
A
Miami.
more sorry to interrupt you again, but like a free throw. Wow, free flowing puncher.
Yes, 1,000%,
God,
1,000%, and a much harder puncher than Cummings. And I don't believe that the full fight film has ever really surfaced because I've never seen it. I've searched for it for a number of years, but that's the thing about Don King and his library is that
he'll
the
get your ass.
yes, the big fights are out there. You can find, all those famous fights the big ones that he promoted. Almost all of them are on YouTube. Fine. But those undercard fights like this one, Jeff Sims against Jumbo Cummings, or just a lot of those very, deep undercard Don King fights that were clearly filmed, have never seen the light of day. They just, you can't find them anywhere. They're just in his archive somewhere sitting in Ohio. I don't know. Like it sucks, you know what I mean? And I wish they would. And anyways, the only clip of it I've seen was when Jeff Sims a few years later was fighting a then undefeated Tyrell Biggs, you know, the former '84 Olympian and gold medalist. And this was like Biggs, one of Biggs's big step up fights when he was fighting Sims. And they were showing video clips. They're like Jim Lampley. This is like, remember when Lampley was working for ABC before he joined HBO? Lampley was doing like the pre-fight, intros and talking about it and all that, and he was talking up about Jeff Sims, and he showed like a 5 or 10 second clip of maybe less than 10 second clip of Sims knocking out Cummings, and it is vicious, it is brutal, it is awful. Sims hits him with this right hand, like just a massive right hand, boom, and Cummings, as massive as he is, the big, like we said, just a giant of a human, just turns into like 260 pounds of pancake batter, just completely evaporates and fall like with nothing and falls face first unconscious. It is like incredible to see because they show it like slow motion. They don't show it like in real time, but you just see Sims hit him and you just see Cummings immediately just melt. It was nasty.
I remember you sending me that a while back. I don't know
Yeah.
if it's still up, but I do remember seeing it. But yeah, dude, it's well, like I said, it's like basically puncher versus puncher, although one puncher is a much more capable and natural puncher than the other. And also, at some point that muscle does catch up. Like
Mhm.
he fought better with that muscle than you'd think. But at some point against a much more natural fighter, it is going to catch up, and it did catch up here. And it, got up obviously in a pretty nasty way. But the funny thing is that even after that, like, you could see that, especially in the early '80s, there was still a really good market for a heavyweight that just looked good and would go
Yeah.
rounds. Like, you know what I'm saying? And that's literally like the kind of role that Jumbo Cummings fell into.
I mean, after that, that was a hard knockout to come back from. And again, I wish the footage of that fight would surface one day, along with not to veer off track, but like along with the footage of Jeff Sims against uh, Jose Rebalta, because that fight took place in 1989. I think Sims was out of the ring for almost 3 years because he got shot or something again, and then which was a reoccurring theme in his life. But apparently, Rebalta was scheduled to be Mike Tyson's next title challenger in a rematch in 1990. And this was on the undercard of Tyson, Carl Williams, and then Sims, like I said, been out of the ring for so long and rusty and whatever, hit Rebalta with a right hand so hard that they said Rebalta's head almost did a 360, like almost like straight up exorcist, like just turned all the way. And then he
Great.
collapsed in a heap, got up to win because, Sims by that point had like the Ernie Shaver syndrome. He could hit you and drop you, but chances are if you got up, he wasn't going to finish you. And, just meandered off to like a decision loss. But Rebalta getting rocked and dropped so hard by it like that and not looking generally good convinced Don King to scratch him and put Buster Douglas in instead to fight Tyson. So, but yeah, like you said, after he gets viciously knocked out by Jeff Sims, he um he lost to a guy named Larry Frazier, and then he ends up fighting an up and coming Mitch Green in 1983. And again, for people that watch the show or listen to it, whatever, like they know Mitch Green, they know that he's not just the punching bag for Mike Tyson and for one-liners and being a crazy person. Like he was a legit fighter in his time, so legit, in fact, that he was a part of that doomed generation, tomorrow's champions, who came out of the ill-fated 1980 Olympics.
Yeah, there
Not that,
was there was a bunch of them. They kind of just like slapped a number of fighters onto that kind of like
yeah,
group, but
that's
he
what I'm
was
saying.
he
Mitch
was
Green
one of
wasn't a
them
part
for
of the
sure.
1980 Olympic team or nothing like that, but he was a high-level amateur that got slapped into that group. Exactly. He was along
Well,
with Tony
and a
Viola.
heavyweight too. So
Yeah.
they people love heavyweights.
There was Mitch Green, there was Tony Ayala, there was Bobby Ches was a part of it, Johnny Bumpus. Those are four off the top of my head. I think I'm missing a couple. Was Rocky Lockridge a part of that group too? I don't know. Lockridge was
I
already
don't know.
challenging for a title by 1980, so I think he might have been before them. But like,
You know,
anyways, those
they had
are, I
like talk
mean,
about like Sean O'Grady, like a bunch of dudes from like right around that time. They'd kind of just like tried to slap into that group.
yeah. And Green was a heavily publicized guy at that point. I mean, obviously his outside the ring activities and just being a general maniac would eventually catch up to him much sooner than later. But early on, no, he was a highly touted prospect. And when he got in there with Cummings, I was like like Cummings at that point now was just being like a stepping stone. He wasn't going to be like relegated to being like a top prospect or anything like that, or a guy that, on the verge of contendership, like people that needed another win on their record. And he was always dependable too. Aside from getting knocked out by Jeff Sims, he hadn't been stopped before. He had only lost decision, so they knew he can go rounds.
Yeah, and I mean, like, like I said, like there was a market for that. There was a market for a heavyweight who looked the part. You just like looked scary. And look, dude, you put fucking Floyd Cummings on a fight poster, people go, "Whoa." You know what I mean? Like, whoa, I want to see what that guy can do. And
I mean, he looked more intimidating than Mr. T.
rightly so. Well, dude, especially back in the day, Mr. T got more intimidating. Like at first he was like he definitely was a scary looking fool, but then like he got more intimidating and like also like confrontational and shit. So yeah, of course the fool is scary. But just naturally, Floyd Cummings, intimidating looking guy, and again, very marketable. Put him in with a guy 10-0 like Mitch Green, or a guy Tim Witherspoon who's 15-1, also a highly touted heavyweight prospect who was just spotty, and according to pretty much everybody who ever looked at him ever, he hated to train and just fucking was just lazy. But I mean, that's unfortunately the kind of role that even Larry Frazier, dude. Larry Frazier at one point was a good heavyweight prospect. It's just that he was kind of unstable. That dude in like 1984 or something like that, that dude attacked a cop while on PCP.
Oh yeah.
But before that, he was a solid heavyweight prospect.
You sure that wasn't Mitch Green?
Yeah, without that might have been Mitch Green too at some point, but Larry Frazier definitely did that.
That's insane, man. And the Witherspoon fight was Witherspoon's first fight after taking Larry Holmes to a razor thin close decision. So, Witherspoon was definitely riding on riding momentum at that point. But you're absolutely right. Witherspoon, a part of the lost 80s generation of heavyweights that people always allude to, um, probably accomplished the most out of all of them when you really think about it. Like, yeah, he did. I mean, yeah, he was the two-time heavyweight champion. That might be an asterisk to it, whatever. But still, the alphabet era, he did become champ twice. Beat a lot of really good fighters. Was the one that really gave Larry Holmes the fucking run for his life. And yeah, overall good fighter. Good fighter that
Had
just
like a decent late career run. Wasn't
yeah.
like great, but it was decent.
And
And had
unfortunately,
he
got
trained
fucked
better, it would
by
have been
Don
better.
King so badly that also affected him too. Like he really got fucked over by Don after while he was champion because he was the only guy that was willing to stand up and was like, "Yo, what the fuck?" and blah blah blah. And the last guy was about to bring up on Jumbo Cummings' record when he went to go fight him in England. Um, Witherspoon was what supposed to get like 1.2 million for that fight, and ended up getting 100,000, which is insane. How do
Yeah.
you cut someone out of
And
nine?
and he even supposedly knew pretty much like the whole time, like while in training, and like he had
Mhm.
like a feeling that something was wrong, and which is why if you look at all the footage and the photos and shit of Tim Witherspoon in training while in the UK, he's just like sitting there because he's
Yeah.
just like, what the fuck, dude? Like there's something ain't right here. I mean, look, there are a lot of good things about Don King, and he just had his 94th birthday. So I don't want to totally shit on him, but when it comes to the early, like late 70s and early 1980s heavyweights, at least, especially with hindsight being 2020, fuck, dude. A lot of those guys had their careers completely screwed over, derailed, and some of them wasn't like 100% his fault, but he definitely did not help, definitely was not a help. And that was one of those cases where, with Tim Witherspoon was not helpful. But in any case, this could have been, I guess, in theory, an opportunity for Floyd. That's several opportunities right there for Floyd Cummings to get one of those wins and to position himself for a potential title shot, which it probably would have had he beaten one of those guys. You know what I'm saying? If Frank Bruno, Witherspoon, Green, probably not Larry Frazier, but Jeff Simmons maybe. If he would have gotten an emphatic win in that one. So but that was not his destiny. Like he just wasn't that kind of fighter. And a lot of these fighters, I think every single fighter we've mentioned here and like that had a name was a fighter who had been fighting a long time, who like had a number of amateur fights and, really experienced, especially compared to Floyd Cummings. So that's at least one facet of it is that they had a lot more opportunities, at least in the gym, than Floyd Cummings ever had. And I mean, that also kind of pivots into his personal life here, which is just, we actually haven't even gotten to what's probably the saddest part of this entire thing. But
Sure.
yeah, his post boxing life was not happy.
No, no, not at all. So, like you said, his career basically well, doesn't basically, it absolutely wraps up in the end of 1983. So he loses a decision to Witherspoon, and then he fights an up-and-coming Frank Bruno. And I mentioned this earlier before where we talked about like, the physiques and stuff like that. Bruno is one of the most chiseled heavyweights in boxing history. Like that guy was just shredded and
Yeah, massive dude.
massive individual. Even when I met him at the Hall of Fame one time, he wasn't as tall as I anticipated him to be, but he was still just a massive individual. He's slimmed down a lot over the years now that he's older and stuff like that, and good for him. But in his prime, no, that dude was just like again, he was looked like he was carved out of stone. And somehow Jumbo Cummings still looked more impressive than he did. Like there's photos of them before their fight. Obviously, they were gonna have them pose together because of their physiques and everything, and Cummings just, it's one of those physiques that you clearly just get out of the jail yard. You know what I mean? Just like that massive upper body from doing reps upon reps upon reps of like crazy weight and then running like you said and then doing, push-ups upon thousands of push-ups. Like Ron Lyle used to talk about how he was able to do 300 push-ups and 300 sit-ups when he was in the hole on a bowl of spinach. And then when he got out of the hole and they gave him like actual meals, he said he was able to do 1,000 push-ups in an hour. And, like shit
That
like
sounds
that.
preposterous, but then you look at him and you're like, no, I believe it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what I mean? And the way Lyle said it too, like he had that smile. He goes, and he was like, I got out of the hole and I got 3 meals a day. He was like, I was able to do 1,000 push-ups in an hour. Like just, you know,
You're like, great,
yeah.
perfect, good for
And
you, sir. Fuck. Yeah, well,
but
dude, no, but for real, Frank Bruno really impressive looking heavyweight, even from very early on. Like he put on muscle, but we're also, I mean, somewhat suspiciously, if we're being honest, because this is just during that time.
of
But like
course,
if you look at his earlier career when he was like kind of a smaller heavyweight, like tallish, 6'2", 6'3", but like, not a huge dude. And he definitely put on muscle during the 1980s, which,
yeah, of
I think just rings suspicion with anybody. But
course.
that being said, yeah, there's some photos of their weigh in or stare down, whatever it is, probably weigh in, probably physical, etc. And then you look at them next to each other, and it's like, holy fuck, because Bruno's already scary looking, and then
Yeah.
Bruno's kind of got a look on his face like, holy shit, it ain't often that I fucking get outshone here.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And Bruno's early career, when he was coming in, he was absolutely blasting dudes out. And like we've talked about other guys too,
It's a
where
lot of rabbit punching. I'm
yeah.
not gonna lie to you, a
Well,
lot
of
of rabbit
course.
punching.
I mean, yeah, yeah. What was your first Bruno fight that you watched? Mine was Oliver McCall.
Oh, I mean, it was around that time anyway. That might have been
Well,
it, but it was around that time.
I mean, I wasn't a fan when he fought Lennox Lewis, so I certainly
No,
watched that. And yeah, but mine was the McCall fight. And I remember getting engrossed in it when my dad, because I was a kid and I was just like,
sounds about right.
this is like the early, really, really, really early time of me becoming a boxing fan. So I was just kind of into everything. And to see a guy who I listened to a story about losing a few times and now getting a chance to win it in his hometown, and he was winning it, and like, and you see him gas at the end and still hold on to win. I was hyped. Like it was pretty cool to watch that. But anyways, early in his career, he was blasting everybody out, like, within 3 to 4 rounds. And there was, just a lot of UK journeymen, but there was also a couple of American names in there too that we've talked about. One, the aforementioned Scott Ledoux, who I brought up earlier in the show, and then another one, our old friend, poor Bill Sharkey, because he had no business being in the ring for that fight. Bill Sharkey, the a guy that we profiled on the show a few years ago for a true crime episode, and had a really sad ending, but like, a very tough, rough and tough, small heavyweight the cruiserweight division when it first came to fruition, he did fight in it briefly, but like a guy that he knew the heavyweight division was where the money was at, so he would try to go scrap in there. But like in his very last fight of his career, he fought Frank Bruno, and it's sad to watch because like Sharky just looks like he's tiny. He's tiny compared to Bruno, and you see it immediately. And Bruno just kind of swats him like a fly, and poor Sharky just gets hit. Gets turned into fucking dust immediately. But all of that being said, that leads up to his fight with Jumbo Cummings in 1983, at the end of 1983 in October. And what's what's interesting about this fight is that though Cummings ends up losing, he almost caused a dramatic change in the course of Frank Bruno's career in the first round because, as they're exchanging punches near the end of it, Cummings ends up throwing a nasty right hand that lands on Bruno's temple, like right on the top of it. And Bruno just immediately, not dissimilar to Cummings getting knocked out by Jeff Sims, but like, because Bruno is still conscious, but like his brains are scrambled. Like he's absolutely just like boom. And then you hear the announcers, the British announcers, which I absolutely love because they always, when one of their guys gets hurt or something like that, they get very excited. Oh no, oh no, Bruno is finished. Bruno is hurt. He's done. Like, they started yelling like he was you should.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's like, oh
Literally,
shit.
oh
Yeah,
no.
they get into that shit.
Yeah. He was like, Bruno is gone. Oh, he has no legs. Oh no. Like they have no bias. Like they clearly they show their biases whenever one of their guys gets hurt. That's what we were worried about. Oh God.
Bruno's been chinned. He's been
Yeah.
chinned. Yeah.
And it's actually a hilarious scene where is it Terry Lawless or George Francis? I want to probably say George Francis, I want to say. That's like 5'5", carrying the lifeless body of Bruno, trying him back to the corner while his legs are just dragged behind him.
Yeah, that's probably Terry Lawless.
Okay, yeah, it'd been Terry Lawless, yeah. Like he's grabbing him, he's just like, come on. You just see Bruno out. And it was a nasty right hand, a really nasty right hand. And had that happened 40 seconds before that, I don't care how bad Cummings was as a finisher, because he showed that in the Frazier fight, but like Bruno was so gone, you and I could have been able to finish him at that point. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and he also, we talk about muscle really slowing a fighter down and not and doing them a disservice. That was one of the issues with Frank Bruno throughout his career was that once
Sure.
he did put on that muscle, he seemed to be gassed in the later rounds, sometimes not even the later rounds. If he went and, threw a lot of punches in one round, like he might have a problem the next round, or he might just kind of go dormant and shit like that. And, he was kind of a clubbing puncher, kind of a mauling guy inside and stuff like that. And those were sometimes good things, but that was also kind of a knock on him. But, he to his credit, he had a big heart, and that was a big reason why a lot of fans really liked Frank Bruno. He's a very likable guy, a stout heart, kind of a heroic type of figure, kind of a not I don't want to say an anti-hero because that's not what an anti-hero is, but like a hard luck hero type of guy who shows up. He might not have gotten it yet, but he's going to show up and he's going to fucking try until finally he did. You talked about the McCall fight. So, in any case, this was not that far into his career. He was an unbeaten at like 19-0 or something like that. But, yeah, like that was just the role that Floyd Cummings stepped into, but he almost got it. That was as close as he came.
It really was. And then, Bruno, Bruno, who fought guys like Mike Tyson, Lennox Lewis, and others who were monster punchers. Tim Witherspoon, who was a monster puncher, kind of underrated in that regard. Bone Crusher Smith. Um, he said at the after his career ended, and apparently still says it to this day, that Jumbo Cummings hit him harder than anyone ever with that right hand. He said that was the hardest he was ever hit. And I mean, like, think of some of the punches we've seen him take, like Mike Tyson in that first fight with those uppercuts that he ripped him with, and Bruno's head just snapping back like a Pez dispenser. Or he was competitive in that fight, very competitive. I mean, he got dropped and he was like getting bullied around, but he had his moments. Or the Lennox Lewis fight where he was very competitive and in fact winning, I think, on the scorecards before he just the tip, the inevitable Bruno collapse, and he just fell apart. He was doing really good against Witherspoon before he collapsed, and he was beating Bone Crusher Smith relatively easily too before he fell apart in that one as well. So it's like, the only fight he was like really blown out in was the rematch with Tyson because he was one step out the door and petrified and God knows what else. But like,
Yeah,
no,
at that point it was like he had won and that was it. You know what I mean? Like he had
yeah,
nothing else to that was already it. But yeah,
sure. And so Bruno comes back to rally to stop Cummings. And I mean, it was like kind of a wild shootout here and there. And Bruno definitely had to like gather himself. And that was his first, which were kind of, the way to actually, to segue this really quick, this is what we want to see happen to Moses Iotama. The one, the massive prospect who they're trying to shove into to fight Usyk right now. And he just came off an incredible first round blowout over, Dillian White and has looked incredible so far in his career. But everyone is trying to
yeah,
push him. Oh,
everybody's already yeah, they're acting like he's already there and it's like, dude,
exactly. They're like,
come
oh,
on.
he needs to get Usyk now. He's ready. He's ready. Blah 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 blah. Like, fine, but no. All right, let's see him against like a seasoned guy who's really gonna test him. And not to say like a Jumbo Cummings would have been able to test a guy like Iotama, but like,
But a
you know,
moment like that.
a moment he needs a moment like that. You know what I mean? Like Bruno had to go through his moment. Michael Grant, even though he eventually imploded, he had to go through his moment with Galata before people were like, oh shit, like he can come back and deal with adversity. And there's been Larry Holmes got dropped early in his career, even before he became champion by Kevin Isaac, and had to go through some shit. Like, people have to go through stuff and like, go through adversity, and that's what really tests them. And you're like, all right, now I can see it like Ali with Doug Jones, like anything like that. You know what I mean? Some kind of gut test that's like gonna push them. And
Yeah.
that's what we're still waiting for. And that's what Bruno ended up getting with that one. But unfortunately, Cummings' career ended after that fight. Could he have continued on? Yeah. I mean, I could have seen him again. Yeah, well, his career was where it was at that point. He just would have been a stepping stone and more of a journeyman where he've accumulated losses, probably against the likes of Tyrell Biggs, who probably would have fought someone like that, or early on, and other heavyweights from that time.
Yeah, I mean the biggest issue was that basically in so he I think that he was probably lined up to fight some more, but the biggest issue obviously was that in
Outside of the ring troubles.
his outside of the ring troubles. I mean, I don't know his circumstances. I can't speak to whatever it was he was going through. I really have no idea, to be honest. But I do know that, look, like I kind of mentioned and or alluded to earlier, even today, in 2025, it's not really any different. If you're a felon or somebody who has served a lot of time in prison or something like that, I can't even imagine the difficulty you would face just trying to find a job, like even just a regular job. And then even in finding a job, you might still face a whole lot of adversity as far as what you're able to. You might not be able to get certified to do a lot of stuff anyway. I don't want to make a bunch of excuses, but we do know that Floyd Cummings definitely did not go on to become a tax-paying member of society. He instead kind of like went back to, I don't even really want to say his old ways because he was in prison for so long that he, went into prison as a teenager and then came out and was a fighter for a little while. And then after, well, it wasn't even after fighting, he basically probably needed money. And so here's what happened in 1984. Boxer hit with felony. Floyd Jumbo Cummings, the convict turned boxer who fought ex heavyweight champion Joe Frazier to a draw in 1981, faces another big fight this week, which was in August, almost exactly to the day, actually, in 1984. Felony charges in the attempted abduction of a Michigan man. Cummings, 33, and Johnny Lee Murphy, 28, both of Chicago, are to begin trial Wednesday in Newaygo County Circuit Court in the attempted abduction of Edwin Hagen, the apparent target of a paid "quote unquote" hit authorities said. The men were being held in lieu of 2,000 blah, 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 resisting arrest, 5 counts of carrying a concealed weapon, and 1 count of attempted kidnapping. So that's what happened. Why? I don't know. I mean, he'd have a better answer for that, but they basically, I guess, accepted money to do a hit or to try to facilitate a hit on somebody for some reason and got caught, and he went back to jail because he was already out kind of on from some
Yeah.
conditional release or parole or something, even though this was 1984 and he had been released several years earlier. But he went back to prison and he was again released. I mean, yeah, I can't even hold on. I think it said over here, blah 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 blah. No, it didn't say how long he stayed, but he was in prison for a long time. But then he was released again. And in 2002, 52-year-old Floyd Jumbo Cummings punishment was handed down Friday by Cook County Judge Joseph Kazmierski. Cummings was convicted in June of 2002, that is, of stealing $250 in a video cassette recorder from a fast food restaurant in 2000. It was the third felony conviction for Cummings, so he spent about 15 years in prison again, got out.
And he was supposed to, at that point, keep this in mind. I think under the Illinois three strikes rule, he was supposed to go to prison for life after that. That's how he was initially convicted for, like for life in prison, wasn't it?
And so this was sentenced to life in prison under the state's three strikes law. Um, this Boxing Times magazine, I don't know what the fuck Boxing Times magazine is. So okay. Um, yeah. Career ended 3 years later when another person convicted. Okay, that's just what I said a couple minutes ago. So, yeah, he once again found his way back into prison and was in prison for a long time. And then a couple of years ago, wound up essentially what happened was he had health difficulties while serving this term, which was supposed to be a life term in prison. He developed health issues, and obviously, even just by visibly looking at him, he did not look very good. And he was released, but after being released, he was put into kind of like a halfway house type of facility where he could get some help with his health, and also kind of try to transition into being a civilian. But that didn't really work out so well either because that entire thing, some funding issue wound up happening with that, and then he wound up having to get assistance again while free, and then Eris.
Um, Up until recently, it seems that, well, up until recently, no one really knew, like you said, Pat, that he was out of jail. They found out he was released, and like you said, he was released into a halfway house. But like you said, with his health issues, including one where I believe they said he had dementia. Correct.
Yeah, he had been having some sort of neurological issue, I guess.
And it's interesting too, like that a lot of these guys, they don't have particularly long careers, but it still shows you that the damage they incur in boxing, they still get dementia or whatever it may be. You know what I mean? Like he did I mean, he had a hard life and, his career definitely took some punishment inside of it. And he also had an amateur career that, like, again, that's not really documented as it should be. It might be a lot bigger than anyone really knows, but like, still, it's interesting to see how like certain guys, catch dementia and you don't think that they had like relatively long careers compared to others, like Dwight Cowie, for instance, the late great Dwight Cowie, who just passed away as well. Same thing. He just passed away from dementia. But anyways, I posted about this on Twitter the other day that we were going to do a show on him on Floyd Jumbo Cummings, and I was then informed by a good follower in front of the show, Jay Corpus, as a Jose Corpus, I believe, right?
Yeah.
The right. um, that he said that Jumbo had passed away, and that he said he saw it on Facebook. So I tried to look it up. I didn't see anything in terms of obituaries online or anything like that. But then I went on Facebook and just typed in Jumbo Cummings and typed in, went into the search post, and I found that some of his family members, more than one in fact, had posted up that he had passed back in March. They didn't give an exact date on when it was, but they said he had passed in March and, just offering condolences and stuff like that. So again, it's kind of sad how these things end up, that these guys they fall off the map so much that they don't even get like a proper acknowledgement for passing. Like you're part of the yeah, tongue twister as a motherfucker.
The
IBRO.
eyebrow.
Yeah, the eyebrow. There you go. Your International Boxing Research Organization. Um, and
And yeah, we usually get some
you
notices
get
for like
emails. Yeah, that's one thing
some
you
pretty
and
obscure stuff too.
yeah, you and Gray Johnson, another, friend of the show, usually talk about that a lot, being like, "Oh, so and so passed away, just got an email." Like it happens really frequently. So nothing to come up about this was kind of like, damn, you know? Of
Yeah, and especially because I don't want to weigh it on like, popularity or notoriety
course.
or
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I mean, just speaking logically here, you'd think the guy's been on TV a number of times. He fought Joe Frazier. He fought a number of fighters who were very well known, and you would just think that you would hear of it. But also I think that figures into the conversation and what I was trying to say. I don't consider myself like an inmate advocate or anything like that. I don't necessarily consider myself an advocate for anything per se, but even so, I do think that some of these kinds of things need to be acknowledged. And we need to understand that, like if this is like the prison system and the justice system and like, incarceration is what we're choosing to do to people. Fuck, dude. Now I'm starting to sound like fucking weird, but look, dude. If this is what we're choosing to do with people, though, like people who do commit awful crimes, and I'm not saying these crimes are good or that oh, give them a chance. I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm simply saying that we need to understand the system that we're running,
Yeah,
and that the ass end of the system that we're running is that sometimes when these people do get spit out, sometimes when these people do find their way out of the machine, there's nowhere for them. And that's still a human being. And so, this guy, Floyd Cummings, got forgotten a long time ago. Long time ago. There
yeah.
wasn't even really much about his 1984 crime. Like there was some shit, but not a ton. And then there really was not much about what he did in 2000. Just the bare facts pretty much that he robbed a store and it was $250 and he took a cassette, like,
Yeah.
which is, anyway.
I mean,
So
I think too, like people was like, "Oh wow, why would you steal?" I mean, like a lot of fighters have fallen on hard times and end up doing shit like that. Like the late Ricky Womack, who we covered on a show about Kronk fighters years ago. Same thing. I mean, remember he got busted at a video store or something like that, or
did like
robbing
the
something
exact,
like,
did like the
yeah, it's
exact same
like,
thing. And
people on when at a certain point in your life when the one thing, like you said, when we were talking about earlier, how hard it is to get a job or how hard it is to be like accepted into society with having a record and and all this other shit,
yeah,
all the
he
cards
probably
stacked.
wasn't making shit for a lot of those fights, bro.
Exactly. I'm sure he wasn't any of it, especially if Don King promoted the majority of them, not the Frazier fight, but like a lot of the other ones, the aforementioned ones that we were talking about throughout his career. He definitely was not making shit for those fights because Don was screwing all of his heavyweights. That's why they're called the Lost Generation. That's why they all fell into despair and everything. Don King was the central figure of him fucking with them. And then also them just kind of falling into their own vices because of the domino effect of that or whatever. But like, no, he probably didn't have anything to his name. And then, like you said, coming out of the boxing and his career essentially ended and all that, like, where are you going to turn to? It was just a lot of different, it's
Yeah,
sad.
like what do you want him to do? What
Yeah.
did you want him to do? Like where
But
did you think he was gonna go? You think he was gonna go fucking be like a steel worker tomorrow?
but
No.
one thing I did forget to actually one thing I did forget to bring up, and I have to bring this up now. And this might have been the thing you were alluding to, not his passing, but before he passed away, like you said, after he got and he might have still been actually incarcerated at this point too, is that around 2009, I almost forgot this too, because this is kind of a funny story. But like around 2009, I think it was, or around that time, Cummings, and the first time anyone had heard anything about him in years, probably since he had last time he had got arrested, and made a little bit of headlines for that. Made headlines because he came out and was suing ESPN. And the reason why he was suing ESPN is because he claimed that they show this fight, his fight with Joe Frazier without his consent, and that he said that them showing that fight with Frazier on on their network without his consent had caused all kinds of issues and all the same, basically the same story that everyone says, all irreplaceable damage and harm to my character and this and that and blah 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 blah, and causing me stress or some shit. And then it comes to find out, we were talking about this before the show. I watched a lot of ESPN Classic, all right, when they were showing fights. They usually aired these same fights over and over and over. It was very rare that they showed something new. You know what I
Yeah, like
mean? Like,
I know several sequences of Ali Foreman like by
yes,
heart because it's like
they showed Ali Foreman, Luis Marciano, Duran Buchanan, um, a couple of other Ali fights, like things like that over and over and over and over. And the fact that they had Bill Caton's library and showed like the same 10 fights over and over was still remains very puzzling to this day. But regardless, one fight that I don't recall them ever watching, I definitely would have remembered if they did, was Joe Frazier, Jumbo Cummings. And if anyone in the comments want to correct me on that, please. But that would have been a fight I would have been interested in because, like I said, back then, before there was tape trading and before there was YouTube and anything like that, I'd never seen that fight. There was barely any photos of it. In fact, you know what I mean? I didn't even know, in fact, that was it a KO card or something that Frazier was on, and I didn't even know that was from his last fight because it was like it's a photo of a pudgy looking Frazier wearing the blue trunks, and it's from the Jumbo Cummings fight. But yeah, and he just looks like he's tired, you know. And I remember looking at that card and I was like, what was that from, like, Thriller in Manila or something? No, that was from the fucking Jumbo Cummings fight that they, some whatever reason, wanted to post that on as a card. But I had never seen it. And I would have remembered seeing that fight because it would have been, I'm into, for whatever reason, I've always been into like watching former champions and other guys in their last few fights looking really washed up, and just, it's like a morbid curiosity, you know?
they posted some photo of it. I think it was a photo of Floyd Cummings like making some face at Frazier, and Frazier's
Yes,
back's kind of turned. And they had that in some magazine back in the day, but that's all I remember seeing of it. I never saw the video or anything before YouTube. So I mean, that would have been nice, but it turned out that the lawsuit got stricken down because ESPN argued we didn't even show that fight.
exactly.
So it's pretty fucking funny. I
Yeah, they would
mean,
just play. We didn't, and
I don't
even if
blame him for trying.
and even if they did, he'd have no rights to it. Like, to himself being like, you can't show this, you know.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty it's a reach. Like, man, they showed a fight where where it was a draw, and it was a bad draw, so I'm distressed. No, that's not
Yeah.
going to hold up in pretty much
People
any
in
court.
jail are telling me they're watching this. Or something like that. I'm like, it just, yeah, there was literally no meat on the bone for any type of lawsuit. It was just someone just trying to grab some money at the end of it, whatever. But like, yeah, like I said, I never recalled watching that. I asked you, you said you never recalled watching it. It was never shown. I think the first time I watched it was on YouTube, and I don't even think I finished the fight. I watched like 3 rounds. I was like, this sucks, and I just changed it.
Yeah, it's a sloppy kind of not good fight.
A dimly lit room and just awful, and
Yeah, looks like a little ballroom type of deal. It's not good. But in any case, yeah, so just kind of, I guess, to wrap up for the most part, at some point you just have to consider that the dude was in prison. So if he did indeed pass away, which it sounds like, that's pretty legit because there were people with the last name of Cummings that sounded like they were related to him, basically saying like rest in peace, rest in peace, Jumbo, and stuff like that.
And they were also, not to cut you, but they also posted like photos of him looking more
Yeah,
recent,
like
like
somewhat recent. Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
out of jail and looking elderly and kind of
Right.
frail.
So it seems pretty legitimate. And again also weird because, we talk to Gray Johnson from BoxRec somewhat frequently, and they usually have a pretty good beat on like, that stuff too, because they get notices from the IBRO,
Yeah.
obits, etc. So it sounded like it went under the radar for them as well. But in any case, the whole point is that if that is true, then he was about 75 years old, which means that he spent about 50 years of his life in prison.
That's insane.
So at 75, you get to live about a third of that
Yeah.
out of prison. That, regardless of what anybody thinks about his crimes, that's sad. That's fucking sad.
Yeah.
That a human being's locked up that long. That's fucking sucks. So, and
And
anyway,
by the time he gets out, he can't even enjoy it because he's already, you know,
yeah, he was already kind of struggling, and there wasn't really much for him to do, unless you have like a wealthy relative or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's not like what unless somebody can like take care of you, then there wasn't much for him to do. So, in any
kind of
case,
not dissimilar from, the case of James Scott when he finally got out. And Scott, well, I think the same thing, was put into a halfway house, and I think he lasted a few years out. Um, well, definitely because definitely Tris Dixon was able to interview him, I believe, and talk with him and such. But like, it was sad too because he eventually developed dementia and all of that, and just
yeah, and again, not to kind of hammer it down with the sadness thing
yeah,
here, but you also kind of just stop to consider that he's not alone, that there are a lot of not just fighters, too. Obviously, there are a lot of fighters who had similar circumstances, but also non-fighters
yeah,
who had similar circumstances. That's
totally,
sad. But also, again, one of the reasons why we do these kinds of shows is so that people remember, is so that these are not anonymous people who just kind of go to the wind, so that, somebody remembers something.
exactly. I'm happy to do them. So
For sure. It is kind of morbid and it does kind of take its toll or whatever at some point, but also just kind of the price we pay for being boxing fans in some way. So Aris, dude, I appreciate you, bro. It's always good to do these kinds of history shows. I'm sure we'll be back, but thank you.
always, man, always a pleasure. I hope that everyone listening gets something good out of it, and we do this justice. So
I hope so. One of the things I don't normally kind of like acknowledge this on the show, and I mean, it doesn't really matter, I guess, if we do or we don't. But sometimes that we do actually, you and I, away from the show, talk about that we really appreciate that every so often when we do shows, usually about like individuals, when we do shows about like certain fighters, often true crime shows, but not always true crime shows. Somebody who knew that fighter shows up in the comments on YouTube. It's happened like probably a dozen, maybe or more times. And
yeah,
so it's almost always positive. And so we appreciate that because I think that that's kind of like a little bit of motivation. Look, dude, we get like a couple hundred views on these videos and shit. We're not stars. We're not well known for our podcast or any of that kind of thing. And we're not looking to be. It's all good. We're not trying to be famous. I feel like, and I think Eris agrees, that it's far more important to be able to reach family members and stuff like that and have them be like, damn, somebody remembers. Way
yeah.
more important. So I appreciate that.
Same, same. I've mentioned this before that I love the fact that, a lot of these guys don't get light shed on them too much, or and so family
And
members.
not positive light too. Like a
Yeah,
lot of it's just
exactly.
shit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so like family members will see. Well, obviously they'll Google them and try to look up anything they can or something like that, and then they're going to see, oh, there's a podcast on this. This is interesting. Oh, it's almost 2 hours. Let me watch this. And they'll listen to it and they're just like, oh, this is amazing, like cool, blah 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 blah. And then, like you said, they comment, and it's a nice feeling because it shows that we're just reaching these people and at least keeping their memory alive. So yeah,
Yeah, we're not getting paid a lot of money to do this. No sponsors, nothing like that. This is just out of the love of, history of boxing. So appreciate you, bro. I know that we both appreciate everybody who listens in and everybody who watches. If you listen, go and subscribe. Knuckles and Gloves podcast. Look that up.
Mhm.
Rate it, comment, etc. Same thing on YouTube. Subscribe, rate, comment, blah blah blah. Eris, talk soon, bro.
Have a good one.